It was all good last week, now you're looking at a stretch from the circuit. You're looking at a brand new Merc. Ain't perfect, gotta get a brand new Merc.
Alright, well this is weird. So, I'm Joseph. I'm a Regeneration Officer at the Greater London Authority, co-host of Sound Advice, Ambassador of the London School of Architecture, and a lecturer at St Martin's. It's a bit of a Twitter level bio and introduction. So this evening I'm going to be reading from Akala's book Natives, and then also from Nels Abbey's Think Like a White Man, some do's and don'ts for black people. So I guess let's begin. So with the book, Akala's book Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, I'm not going to start at the beginning, but I'm going to start from an interlude. It's called A Guide to Denial. Then I'm going to flick through to another chapter called Empire and Slavery in British Memory, and then I'll, if I've got time, move on to Think Like a White Man. So let's begin. In a racially structured polity, the only people who can find it psychologically possible to deny the centrality of race are those who are racially privileged, for whom race is invisible precisely because the world is structured around them. Whiteness as the ground against which the figures of other races, those who, unlike us, are raced, appear. That's a quote from Charles Mills and the Racial Contract. Before we go any further, I think I need to address the fact that discussions about race in the UK are rather fascinating and often coloured by what I'm going to call a very British brand of racism. Polite denial, quiet amusement, or outright outrage. That one could dare to suggest that the mother of liberty is not a total meritocracy after all. That we too, like so many less civilised nations around the world, have a caste system. People who can see so clearly the very real injustices of other nation states, or even perceive how positive aspects of British history have shaped the country's current reality, somehow become unable to think that when the lens of examination is turned inwards. If you have ever attempted to discuss a social ill with a person who is intensely invested in the order of things as they are, you will have no doubt been met with some rather odd and profoundly anti-intellectual responses. So it sounds like Akala watched the BFA event the other day. This phenomenon of self-induced stupidity seems to be particularly pronounced and almost laughably predictable when we attempt to discuss Britain's racist history and reality with many people racialised as white. Here are a few of the likely counter-arguments that will be used in an attempt to silence you. I'm going to do like, if we stop talking about racism, it will go away. Well, Morgan Freeman agrees with you. You'll be happy to know, so you have your black man validation for ignorance. You should need to deploy it on a race-obsessed idiot. But this idea that racism will vanish if we just refuse to discuss it is rather fascinating. Imagine for a moment if scientists and engineers thought in this way. Imagine they said, right, the best way to solve a problem is not to discuss, confront or challenge it, but to leave it alone completely and hope it just works itself out. There would be no political, moral, technological, medical, material or mental progress ever in the fragile history of our species if people hadn't decided to confront difficult problems with dialogue and then action. Stop playing the race card. Racism is apparently a card to be played, much like the Joker. It's a very versatile card that can be used in any situation that might require it. Only non-white people ever play this card to excuse their own personal failings, even those of us who are materially successful. Humans racialised as white cannot play the race card, just like they cannot be terrorists. So European national empires colonising almost the entire globe and enacting centuries of unapologetically and open racist legislation and practices, churning out an impressively large body of profoundly racist justificatory literature and cinema and much else has had no impact on shaping human history. It has really just been black and brown people playing the cards. Why can't you get over it? It's all in the past. These two statements often run together. Apparently history is not there to be learned from. Rather, it's a large boulder to be gotten over. It's fascinating because in the hundreds of workshops I've taught on Shakespeare, no one has ever told me to get over his writing because it's, in the past. I'm still waiting for people to get over Plato or Da Vinci or Bertrand Russell, or indeed the entirety of recorded history, because it seems they just won't. It is especially odd in a nation where much of the population is apparently proud of Britain's empire. The critics of one of its most obvious legacies should be asked to get over it. The very same thing from the past they are proud of. But anyway, let's imagine for a second that humanity did indeed get over, which in this case means forget, the past. Well, we'd have to learn to walk, talk, and cook, and hunt, and plant crops all over again. We'd have to undo all of human invention and start from when? This period exactly is it that we are allowed to start our memory from? Those who tell us to get over the past never seem to specify, but I'm eager to learn. In reality, of course, they don't want to. They just don't want to have any conversations that they find uncomfortable. You have a chip on your shoulder. This is one of my personal favourites. No one could quite define what a chip on a shoulder actually is, but we know that young black boys in particular seem to suffer from them, even when these young black boys grow into materially successful men. You can watch the accompanying chip grow ever larger should they discuss any political issues of racial injustice. Examples of people with enormous chips on their shoulders include Muhammad Ali and Colin Kaepernick, men who gave up millions of dollars to protest injustice. In this materialistic world, even political opponents of Ali Kaepernick should, in theory at least, admire their willingness to forego personal comfort and even risk their lives for something so much bigger than themselves. They could have easily kept quiet and just continued being widely admired multimillionaires. But hey, their political opponents were pro-bombing gooks thousands of miles away. In one case, they are determined to ignore police brutality. Even police are caught on camera executing 12-year-olds playing in the park. So not much hope for logic from them then. Why don't you just go back from where you came from? This one is so unimaginative I hardly know how to respond. Their assumption is that anyone who is not racialized as white is not really a citizen, echoing the old white supremacist adage, race and nation are one, and the blood and soil logic of the Nazis. When people say this to me, I presume they mean Jamaica, as Scotland is still part of Britain for now. Bless them. Their view of the so-called third world is so blinkered that they think they are insulting me when they say this. Yes, Jamaica has many problems with violence and poverty, but as elsewhere on the globe, the problems of Jamaican society predominantly affect those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. As a member of the diaspora with some money, I would be, and I go back regularly, shielded from the worst aspects of Jamaican society. There I am one of the privileged, even in a racial sense, as being light-skinned or mixed carries it with the assumptions of being from the upper class in the Caribbean. None of my middle-class Jamaican friends experience anything like the levels of violence and police harassment that I experienced growing up poor in the UK. Many of them went to private school, never missed a meal, and had parents who drove flash cars, unlike mine. Don't get me wrong, there are obviously opportunities and privileges and infrastructure that British citizens have access to that much of the world does not. But it is not as simple as many think. I can promise you that wealthy and middle-class Jamaicans, though few in number, have better material conditions of life than the poorest people in the UK. They are not living off food banks, and well, it's impossible to freeze to death in the winter. Aside from that, the country is one of the most naturally beautiful places on the planet, with a strong and proud culture and community. There are many reasons why our grandparents chose to migrate, but hatred of their home countries was not one of them. Well, why don't you just go back to Africa then, in brackets, even though you're from the Caribbean? Similar to the last one, those that say this believe the idea of racial credit. They believe that all black people, regardless of class, nationality, political inclination, or personal achievement, share racial credit for the shortcomings of the African continent's post-independence leadership. Conversely, they also believe that all those racialized as white, no matter how mediocre they may be in terms of personal intelligence and actual achievements, share some racial credit for the works of Russell, Da Vinci, and Tesla. And for the prosperity of the modern West, even if they have personally played no role in creating this prosperity. Most interestingly, millions of European Americans whose great-grandparents migrated to America only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from Germany, Italy, Russia, and Ireland say the same thing to black Americans whose ancestors arrived in the USA much earlier, not to mention the indigenous population. Again though, this is not an insult. I have travelled across much of the continent and I may well decide to move back where my father's parents came from, or to that country called Africa, but it will be because that's where I choose, not because some fool thinks that's where I belong. However unfair this statement is though, there's a degree of realism to it in that as long as African and Caribbean states are politically, economically and militarily weak, lingering ideas of black inferiority will still have an aura of credence, even for many liberals. Bigots here are helpfully suggesting to black people that the unfinished project of a political Pan-Africanism still awaits us. You should be grateful that you have free speech. There are a few interesting things applied by this one. First, the idea that free speech is uniquely British. Never mind that Britain shares with so many other states a long history of suppressing criticism at home and in its colonies, and therefore something I would not have had if I lived elsewhere. Second, the second implication, that the degree to which Britain has free speech was a gift from enlightened leaders rather than a hard-won right. The Chartists might disagree, but much of Britain seems depressingly committed to forgetting its own radical history. Third, the idea that one should be grateful that your government does not kill, torture, or imprison you for criticisms is an extremely low bar of expectation, coming from people who are apparently proud of their nation's democratic credentials. Intriguingly, Jamaica ranks in the top 10 for press freedom globally, ranking 8th in 2017, for example, sandwiched between Switzerland and Belgium, while Britain has slipped 12 places to 40th in global rankings over the past 5 years. As you can see, Britain has been quite substantially behind its former colony in respect for quite some time, despite Jamaica facing much graver political challenges. Furthermore, almost all of Jamaica's most prominent music artists have spent a good portion of their careers cussing the Jamaican government, and while general police brutality is a serious problem in Jamaica, the kidnapping and torture of critical artists by the state has been virtually unheard of over the past 3 decades. If artistic free speech and press freedoms exist in the much more politically challenging terrains of Jamaica, Trinidad or Ghana, all 3 of which have ranked higher above Britain in the last year in press freedoms, what exactly should we be so grateful for here in the 6th richest nation on the planet? You just hate Britain, you're anti-British. This one is related to many of the others, in that it implies that those of us that critique Britain's historic and current injustices are not real citizens of the country. Again, if we compare with how critical artists are treated and viewed in some other nations, the odyssey of the anti-label becomes apparent. For example, Fela Kuti is unquestionably Nigeria's most legendary musical icon, yet he was a constant opponent of the Nigerian government and critic of the failings of Nigerian society, to the point that the army killed his mother. Yet they could not shut him up. His sons continue that critical tradition today. Do Nigerians in general consider him anti-Nigerian and a hater of the country because of this? No. In fact, quite the reverse. He is the country's greatest musical hero. The situation is much the same with Jamaican reggae musicians who have had to struggle against poverty, endemic class snobbery, and the Jamaican state's persecution of the predominant religion, Rasta, to become some of the most important and respected voices in Jamaican society, and indeed the entire world music. Even if we return this idiocy to white Britain, what would have happened to the top puddle marchers, the suffragettes, Tom Paine, the Chartists, those that campaigned to end child labour and slavery had all shut up for fear of being called anti-British? Put simply, many of the freedoms that people take for granted simply might not exist. What more, this anti-British label shows that the person using it conflates the interests of the British ruling class and their cronies in the House of Lords and the arms, oil and banking cabals with the interests of British people as a whole. That said, I'm not a nationalist, so to be accused of lacking sufficient patriotism does not fill me with indignation. But what about insert any injustice here? Yes, I'm aware there's still a caste system of persecution of Sikhs in India, and that the Islamic world has had several slave-holding waves of empire centuries before the rise of the modern West, and that Islamic fascism, Hindu fascism in India, and the persecution of Muslims in Burma all exist. I'm aware that the Kurds, Ainus, West Papuans, Palestinians, and indigenous Jamaicans and Australians, and a whole host of other people have far worse suffering to speak of than black people in Britain. I am aware that no human community is perfect, and that injustices exist everywhere. You have not made an insightful observation by distraction. Additionally, the idea that the spread of Euro-American imperialism has played no role in helping cement or prolong some of the injustices is, well, rather quaint. But even if that were the case, we could deflect from any number of injustices with the what about clause. There are great studies on all of the above subjects, and this book does not negate any of them. You're obsessed with identity politics. This one is all the rage lately, and identity politics is spoken about as if it was something entirely new. Sorry, that's my IK dishwasher going off. This one is all the rage lately, and identity politics is spoken about as if it was something entirely new. Of course, in reality, Britain has a long history of crafting politics not around merit or even solely class distinctions, but also around white identity. Also, please explain to me how politics is not part identity politics. Our working class, especially in a post-industrial welfare state, Irish, Christian, Jewish and Japanese, not all identities. Please explain how human, organised into any group identity, can have identity-less politics. Again, if you do not want to hear from and engage with people from and my identity or the experience we've had a result of that identity, no worries, put the foot down. Don't follow me on Twitter or watch me on YouTube. I'm not stalking you. You are trying to blame me for what my ancestors did. This one usually arises when discussing the particularly sensitive area of British role in the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. I never owned slaved, or so the straw man logic goes. Well, of course, everybody knows that no one alive in Britain today owned an African person. That does very little to change how significant a role slavery played in Britain's history. Also, as the writer Gary Young once explained, people in Britain naturally take pride in positive national events they had no direct role in. We won the World Cup, we won the war, yet many seem less willing to confront more negative aspects of our history. People seem rather happy to align themselves with the Dunkirk spirit, but rather less interested in acknowledging the Amritsar spirit. Stop making excuses. If you were to ask why Northern England is so much poorer than the South, or why Southern Italy is so much poorer than the North, why East London is poorer than the West, or why Glasgow and Belfast have been so much more violent than other UK cities, you will likely get an explanation grounded in history, politics and economics, and not be told those explanations are just making excuses. For the innate failings of the Northern English, Southern Italians, or citizens of Belfast and Glasgow, the Stop Making Excuses clause is there to suggest that black people are not permitted to make use of the very same tools available to the rest of humanity to understand the shape of their communities today because of their black skin. An inferior culture is sufficient explanation for any issues that they might be having. As people say this to me personally so often, let's just recap on my family history and current position as briefly outlined in the last chapter to assess what I'm supposed to be making excuses for. Both my mother's parents were alcoholics. My father grew up in and out of care, and I grew up in a single-parent home on free school meals. As I'm sure you're aware, most children eligible for free school meals do not achieve 5 GCSEs. All 3 of my mother's other children and I got 10 GCSEs and lead very successful lives, so I'm unsure exactly what I'm supposed to be making excuses for, as my life has panned out wonderfully well from a personal perspective. However, one of the main reasons me and my siblings were able to navigate life growing up was because we were made to understand very early that poorer children, and poorer black children in particular, would have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Apparently, me passing on the useful knowledge of how racism and poverty are deliberately reproduced is making excuses for poorer children to fail. Nonsense. I am genuinely surprised that people do not get embarrassed looking at where I have come from and what I've done in my life when they try to hit me with the Stop Making Excuses clause. But that is the tone-deaf nature of such persons. You just blame the West for all the world's problems. This one is the geopolitical equivalent of Stop Making Excuses and is usually aimed at anyone who dares suggest that the disproportionate influence of Western power may still be having an impact on global human relations. If you ask the person saying this which African or Asian scholars work they do think could, or African or Asian scholars work that they think could be usefully described as blaming the West for everything, they will not be able to tell you, of course, because such a body of scholarship simply does not exist. Post-colonial African, Asian and Caribbean scholarship takes a basic assumption for the obvious fact that non-white people are people and thus quite capable of oppressing one another without mighty whitey's assistance. In fact, the body of scholarship generally points out that the great challenges faced by masses of Africa and large parts of Asia are caused precisely by the fact they have 2 sets of oppressors, greed to sedate, and their own domestic elites and the international corporations and foreign states their domestic oppressors often serve and collaborate with. If you point out the simple and obvious fact that long after the official colonial period, Western governments have been perfectly happy to install and support the most gruesome of dictator regimes and also overthrow democratically elected presidents as and when it suits them, this will be labelled blaming the West for everything. You need not worry though, as adjectives and slogans are not counter-arguments, of course. I didn't see colour. This one does make me laugh, as it is grounded in the idea that colour itself is negative, rather than the associations that have been forced upon it. It is so absurd to suggest that you don't see a person's colour that I can think of no better testament to difficulties people have discussing race than this silly but often quoted one-liner. It's not about race. Nothing's ever about race. You should know this by now. In reality, the idea of race has been one of the most important ideas in the modern world. It has underpinned centuries of enslavement, justified genocide, and been used to decide the line between who lives and who dies, who gets access to rights of citizenship, property, migration, and the vote. Do not want to debate, discuss, and deal with an idea that has been so impactful reveals a palpable lack of interest in humanity, or at least certain proportions of it. There are many variants on these non-arguments. You can't defeat them with a common sense, and you cannot nor should you waste your time trying to persuade everyone. So that's the last bit I'm going to read from Akala's Natives, but I suggest you get it. And then in sound advice, I've got 10 minutes left. Cool. In very sound advice sort of manner, I'm going to read from Nels, Abbey's Think Like a White Man, and in the book he has 187 quick do's and don'ts for black people, and I'm going to read the first 17 of them. Do cape for whiteness as if your life depends on it. Your career certainly does. Do follow your passion if you're able to work on something that you're passionate about and truly love. Then it will make working 20,000 times as hard as your white peers that little bit more bearable. Do demonstrate all the proper emotions in a convincingly exaggerated manner, and usualize profoundly on the death of a mediocre yet widely loved by white people white celebrity or tusk-bearing wild animal. Don't wear a bow tie and a black suit if you're a man. Don't wear an all-white, nun-like habit if you're a woman. It goes without saying that a niqab, hijab, burqa or do-rag are absolutely out of the question. Everything that makes you look like a member of the Nation of Islam, or even worse, a conventional non-Prism Islam Muslim, is career suicide. Wear cheap non-branded glasses to interviews, even if you don't need them. It softens your image and indicates a vulnerability as opposed to blackness, plus no one who ever wore glasses did anything black. Do deep black sigh. Relax your hair or maintain an unkept level cut with no partings, waves or fade. Your natural Angela Davis afro will induce rampant perspiration, fear and spontaneous urination. Gents, embrace your Uncle Phil style baldness. A Tupac line clean scalp might remind white folk of Tupac. Do resist the urge to quote rappers during job interviews. Do be inspired by the business moves and drive of rappers. They're some of the most foremost entrepreneurs and successful risk takers of our time. We're the ones who read their contracts before them sign them, they are. Do keep ethnic festivals firmly to yourself when in the office. Kwanzaa, Independence Days of certain African and Caribbean nations, Jay-Z or Beyonce's album release day, the fall of apartheid celebrations and so on are all events which should be celebrated privately and firmly away from the eyes and ears of white folk. Don't wear Vizu, Fubu, Rockaware or Kalkani on Dress Down Day. Tommy Hilfiger and Ralph Lauren should be worn conservatively. Do take full advantage of the coloured people time stereotype. Showing up on time with black skin is occasionally enough to exceed expectations, and then get the door politely slammed in your face. Don't put a picture of any of your legitimate black heroes on your desk, or on your professional or even mobile phone screensaver. No Malcolm X, no Angela Davis, no Fela Kuti, no Harriet Tubman, no Bernie Grant, no Marcus, nothing. A doctored picture of you cuddling Winston Churchill or Margaret Thatcher would be wise. Don't ever stray from Martin Luther King when asked who your black heroes are. Do force yourself to tear up when his I Have a Dream speech is evoked for the billionth time in a blatant attempt to pacify you. Don't smile or tear up when any of Martin Luther King's non-cuddly thoughts are brought up, especially things like his letter from Birmingham jail. Don't profess love or admiration for Malcolm X. In fact, condemn Malcolm for being too extreme for me, too negative, too divisive. Don't forget to wash your mouth out with hot bleach afterwards. Do perfect your diction, i.e. sound as white as polished as possible. This is critical. Sounding remotely like a 21st stepping fetch will damage your career. Irreparably, speaking well, i.e. speaking very well-to-do white people will help your pocket swell. Don't discuss politics, especially not international politics. But if you're forced to, then see to it that you're extremely anti-abortion, anti-immigration, with exception of people from places like Sweden, Norway, and of course Australia, anti-diversity, anti-women's rights, pro-for-profit jails, pro-prison linked slavery, pro-law enforcement, anti-skin beyond a certain shade of brown, pro-leave, and then possibly bomb the EU and make America great again. Thank you very much and have a good evening. And in sound advice style, we'll leave on a song.